Hey, this is Jody with weldingtipsandtricks.com with another weekly video. This week we're going to put a root pass in a 6-inch Schedule 80 pipe coupon. This is in a 6G position. Very typical, very common test. It's the UA number 28, I believe. And here are some of the specs on it. 35-degree bevel plus or minus 5, 0 to 1/8 inch land, gaps 1/16 to 1/8, and 75 to 100 amps if you're using a 1/8 rod for the root pass. Now that can be a problem sometimes, a 75 to 100 amps, because there are times, depending on the size of the land and the size of the gap, you might need closer to 70. And if they're going by the specs that I read on the UA PDF, you got to, if it says 75 minimum, you got to use 75 minimum. So you're going to have to adjust your amps to accordingly, where you can use at least 75 amps with no problem. Now this is the time to kind of gauge that when you're putting the tack welds on there. If you've got a good keyhole and it's not getting too big with you, then you know you're in pretty good shape. But if you're tacking and your keyhole's kind of getting out of control, then you know you might need to turn it down, especially because you're tacking in the horizontal position and you're going to be kind of welding sort of vertical uphill coming off the bottom. So you kind of got to get an eye for how your tacks go in, for knowing the heat, because you're going to be welding on a strange machine if you're going to test somewhere, and it's not going to be the same. Machines make a lot of difference. That's why pipeliners and rig welders are so particular about using their Lincoln SA200 versus a Trailblazer or something like that, because the arc makes a big difference. You need to be able to adjust the arc, and machines have different characteristics, and some of them will kind of let you adjust as you go by using a longer or shorter arc, and it makes a huge difference on an open butt root pass. But anyway, in any event, you'll want to taper, feather your tacks, grind them nice with a nice long feather on each end, so that you can burn into them when you tie in and when you're coming off of them. When you light up on the tack, you need to be able to make a good transition, and that looks something like that. Also, using a really thin grinding wheel, if something closes up with you, it'll let you stick it in there and open the gap back up and get you out of a bind. And that was like a 1/16 wheel there. It works pretty good. Now, how you hold the electrode in the electrode holder is a big deal on a 6G, and this is kind of how I like to do it. I put it in there kind of facing down like that, and the reason is because it lets me twist my wrist as I progress upward, and it keeps the rod angle the same. All I've got to do is gradually twist my wrists as I progress upward, and it keeps that rod angle pretty much aiming toward the center of the pipe, and that's kind of what you want to do in your mind's eye. And when you light up on a tack, the way I do it is I kind of long arc it to begin with and get that tack heated up, and then gradually tighten the arc up, and then when I get to the end, just jam it in there pretty tight and get that keyhole going. Now I've got the rod. I'm kind of scooping out metal as I go forward. I can kind of feel it. I can kind of feel it scooping out metal, and then I go back into the puddle and try to keep it pretty tight. And here I'm tying into a tack, and I'm kind of pushing that keyhole right into the tack, and then I'm going to come out on the on the bevel before I snap out of it. That's not always necessary. Some guys just trail out right on the middle of the tack. And here I'm lighting up again, long arc it a little bit, and then dive on in there nice and close, get the keyhole going. Now this is a little bit wider gap here, so keyhole wants to kind of open up a little bit. The puddle's not coming with me quite as much as it was like on that first tack that I made, but it's not out of hand either. It's definitely within the limits, within the scope. And here, this is a little bit wider gap here, so I'm actually almost making a kind of a small oval shapes, just kind of tying in both walls. And we'll get on the other side in just a minute. That side's pretty much wrapped up. Other side, going to hold the stinger about the same way. It's just a little bit different though, because that's the reason they give a 6G test, is you have to figure out different body positioning for both sides. One side's usually easier than the other for you, depending on if you're right or left-handed. But I'm still got the electrode in there kind of backwards like that, where I can twist my wrist and get a favorable angle on it. And you keep an eye on your gap, because it's going to want to be tighter or looser depending on how the weld draws, and if you have a little bit wider gap, you might want to bump your amperage down 5 or so, and if it's a little tighter, that's the time to bump it up a little bit. I kind of like the way that looks right there, the way that's going in. It's keyholing. I'm able to jam the rod in there pretty tight and kind of just scoop out metal, and then, you know, it lets the puddle chill momentarily while I'm scooping out and keyholing, but it's not out of control at all. And I've got it sped up here so you can kind of see the wrist kind of twisting to keep the rod angle pretty much poking straight toward the middle of the pipe. Now this is a little hot right here. The gap was a little wide. You can handle some variation like that without having to stop and change your amperage, but only to an extent, and a lot of it depends on the type welding machine you're using. Now for this section here, I'm showing you this. This is on the ragged edge of being too hot, and I'm having to kind of make circles and come up on the walls of the pipe to kind of cool the puddle off. And fortunately, it's on the top. You can get away with a little of this on the top a lot easier than you can on the bottom. But now it's keyholing out quite big, and so I'm pushing that keyhole right into the tack. I'm just moving the keyhole along, so I'm making sure to burn in and completely fuse into the tack weld. And finally it closes up right there. And I'll have to go a little bit further to keep from leaving like a crater hole in the root pass. But that does it for the root pass now. Like you saw, it was a little hot in places, a little heavy, a little wide probably, but for the most part it went in pretty much okay. And hopefully it gives somebody some help that's getting ready to go take this test. I guess up next will be the 7018 fill and cap. That might take a couple of weeks to finally get around to doing all that, but meanwhile we'll see it with something. Next, you get in a real bind up there trying to keep a good rod angle. So what works for me is putting the rod in there kind of you know, backwards, kind of downward like this, to where as that rod gets shorter, as I twist my wrist, I can keep the same rod angle from bottom to top, or from, you know, however long the rod burns, from bottom to 90 degrees or whatever. Just turning the wrist as the rod gets shorter keeps a good rod angle. Same thing on this side. Just turn your wrist the other way. Just keep turning your wrist as you weld, and it's easy to keep that rod pointing pretty much straight in, which is kind of what you want to do. So we'll light up off the bottom here. I'm choosing to put one bead over top of that hot pass, and I'm using 1/8 rod here. If they let you use 3/32, it might be a good idea. There's a trade-off though. 3/32, you're going to have a lot more tie-ins, or 1 or 2 more tie-ins anyway, whereas a 1/8 you're only going to probably have 1 tie-in between getting from the bottom to the top. But it's a little bit you know, a little bit more risky as far as blowing through. I have blown through before, going to take a test and putting that root pass in, and then coming back over with a, you know, 7018, and here goes a hole and you're done. So that's nothing sucks worse than that, to drive a long way and then take a test and blow a hole in your root pass. But I've decided to put 1 pass over top of the root pass here as opposed to 2, because when you put 2 passes over top of something that narrow down in the groove like that, you really got to stack them in there right, or it's hard to get that second one in there. You can leave yourself a tight crevice, and it's really you know, you can have lack of fusion, you can trap a little slag or whatever, whereas just a slight weave is a lot less likely to trap any slag or anything. It's a preference thing, and also it might be stipulated the test you're taking. They might want 3/32, they might want 2 passes. You just have to ask. I just decided to put one 1/8 7018 pass over top of that root and hot pass. You see I have ground the start there because it had a little bit of a high place on it. So coming up the other side, It makes for a lot smoother tie-in if you grind the start on the first pass, if they let you grind. I have taken tests before where after you get the tacks feathered, they want the grinder back and they hand you a file, and everything's filing from there on out. They don't want it to be a grinding test, they want it to be a welding test, which I totally get, because some people get carried away and want to grind every single pass slick, and that's just not smart, not necessary, shouldn't ever be necessary. If you have high spots, little, after the first pass is done like this, if you have little high spots on the tie-in, now's the time to knock them down with a grinder. I'm in pretty good shape here to go ahead and run 2 more passes over that, and then I'm going to be in good shape for the cover pass. It'll take 2 passes over that for a good fill, though. Again, I light up ahead of where I want to start, then weld over all those arc strikes, and I'm just kind of lining up halfway over that first pass. I'm trying to leave the bevel. I'm trying not to come all the way out to the bevel, so I have kind of a nice sharp line to put a nice cover pass on. You can see I ground there already where I started to make for a nice tie-in on coming up the other side like this. I use a very slight electrode manipulation, just a little bit, to kind of play the light back and forth, help me see where I'm going. And on tie-ins, I do the same thing as when I start. I light up a little bit ahead and then come right into the crater. Give that 7018 just a second or so to heat up so I can avoid porosity if possible. I got 1 pass over top of that first pass, and now's a good time to knock down any little high places on tie-ins and everything if it's permissible. Now you can see where I've got the rod stuck in there. If I'd have stacked that bead up a little higher, it might put me in a jam where I'd have to take a grinder and kind of wallow that out a little bit. But I'm in pretty good shape here to burn that second pass in there with the 1/8 rod, so no grinding necessary. Now I would generally like to run a little hotter than this. I'm only running about 110 amps here. And the thing about pipe is that when you light up on the bottom, you're welding overhead, which you can stand to weld overhead about the same as you can weld flat, about 120 amps or so. But very quickly you start into the vertical position, and 120 amps is a little bit hot to vertical, and then you'll be crowning up and undercutting and all that stuff. So pipe is kind of a trade-off. You got to set the amperage at a place where it's hot enough for overhead, vertical, and then flat again as you get to the top of the pipe. So again, I'm running about 110 amps here, but I've got the dig set high up to about 77 so I can keep a tight arc and not stick and keep everything under control. So far things aren't going too bad. Got a little bit of that second pass left to put in there. And again, I don't want to melt that straight line of the bevel away if possible. If I come right up to it, that's fine, but I want to, it's kind of like when you're coloring when you're a kid. It's kind of nice to have lines and borders to stay in. So if you keep those lines straight, when you put the cover pass on, you got a better shot of making it uniform if they're not all chewed up. So I'm not in too bad a shape here. What I want to see before I put a cover pass on is I want to be slightly below flush. And that's the bottom right there. So I would take a grinder and knock any crowns off that I thought were going to give me a problem. But I'm not in too bad a shape here to put a cover pass on. And I'm going to go for a 3-bead cover pass. And what I'm watching for here, this is the first bead. I'm doing a little bit of electrode oscillation, I guess you call it. But I'm just trying to overlap the edge of that bevel by about 1/16 of an inch. No more than that. I've seen guys, get carried away and go way out wide, a good 1/4 inch past each side of the bevel. And that's just over welding. More opportunity for things to go wrong. Takes more weld, more bead, more problems. Why ask for trouble? So just overlap that bevel by just just a little bit. I mean, you don't want to just nip it because you can risk not nipping it, but a 1/16 of an inch is a pretty good rule of thumb on how much to overlap the edge of the bevel. And if you take the edge of the rod right to the edge of the bevel, the puddle will flow out a 1/16 of an inch. All right, we're going up the other side now. Again, you can see the edge of the rod, the bottom of that 7018 rod is just about aligned with the bevel when I oscillate it, and then I let the puddle kind of fan out whatever it wants to past that, which is roughly a 1/16 of an inch. 1.6 millimeters for everybody else in the world. So that's what it looks like with that first pass of the cover pass on there. I made it a little bit wide, a little bit heavy, but that was kind of intentional to kind of give me a shelf to build the rest of the passes on. I won't go quite as slow on the next two, but that kind of gives me, that kind of establishes the height of my cover pass, and then just lets me overlap that first pass by half. And here I'm coming up the other side, same thing, overlapping by about a half, and then not quite tying into the top of the bevel. And we're speeding things up here now because I'm trying to keep the video a reasonable length. Here's the last bead. The last bead, I'm really eyeballing the top of that bead because I don't want to leave any undercut at all if possible. So I'm keeping a tight arc, not doing a whole lot of oscillation, and I'm going slow enough to fill in any undercut that might happen. Since I'm not low at all, I'd have to kind of be shaky and whatnot to get any undercut, so it worked out okay. So I'll put the little cup brush on here and shine it up a little bit so we can take a little peek at it, see how we did. So it's not too horrible, not anything to write home about, but that's the bottom you're looking at right there, where all the tie-ins are and where it should be uglier than the rest of it, and it still doesn't look too bad on the bottom. Alright, well, here is a quick rundown of the settings used for this joint.